Hello and welcome everyone to the Asian Voices Youth Radio Podcast. I'm Osden Tong.
I'm Joslin Tong.
And we're going to be your hosts for this special episode today, where we discuss any and all topics related to life growing up as Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. On today's show, we're going to be discussing generational divides, queer stories, and struggles with self-identity. Joining us today on the program is queer Vietnamese American filmmaker and writer Quyen Nguyen-Le. Her short films, including Ngoc, Water, Homeland, and Why, Ongoing Memory, have been screened worldwide in multiple film festivals. Welcome to the show today, Quyen. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
So the entire time I was doing the introduction, all I could think in my head is probably saying this wrong. So let's just go ahead and get on the record today. How do you personally like to pronounce your names and the names of your short film?
Thanks so much for asking. So my name, the way I pronounce it is Quyen Nguyen-Le, and it was actually a decision when I was younger, and we can talk about this, to go by my Vietnamese name, knowing that people will probably mispronounce it, and I think knowing that I appreciate that you tried, and you were not even that far off, so I really appreciate the intention of asking me how to pronounce my name. I think a lot of people are too nervous to even kind of admit that they might not know how to say something. And my two short films that are scripted, I also have documentary films, but the two short scripted films are Nước, Water, Homeland, and Why, Ongoing Memory. And both those films also play on the meaning of the words that are the title of the film.
Okay, that's really interesting. And thank you, by the way, for not making me feel bad about it, because I do know that there are some people out there that'll probably be like, oh, no, this is how you do it. Stop saying it so wrong. But I actually really appreciate that. I do think that that invites people to want to try more to do things properly, and it creates better conversation and dialogue.
Yeah. So, one of the first questions we want to ask you is that for some of the listeners here that haven't heard about Nook, Water, Homeland, or Why Ongoing Memory, can you go ahead and give us a short description of each film as well as the significance behind the messages you've portrayed in both of them?
They're both short films and they're both scripted, but they're based on reality. So some people sometimes refer to them as documentaries, but they are acted. And so Nook was a short film that I collaborated with my friend Ro, who is the main character in the film, and their mother, actually, their actual real mother and child in real
Oh,
life. And that film was just an exploration, I think, of the legacy of the Vietnam War on kind of queer second generation Americans. And I had never at that time seen anything that was really addressing that. And I made it as a part of a fellowship that only allowed 5 minutes. So that film is in 5 minutes. How can you tell us um, about this identity and what you're struggling with? And I would say for that film, what it's about is it centers around this question of like, how do you talk about trauma when you don't speak the same language anymore? And that's a question that the main character asks in their head. And with Why, um, we also wanted to explore this a similar film, right, about like generational divide, but this time with father. So Nook has a mother character and her child, and Why is the name of the main character, and her father. And we wanted to kind of bring kind of discourse about Vietnamese Americans outside of history and memory, right, and put it in more contemporary times. Like what does it mean to be Vietnamese American in the U.S., and not just speaking about the Vietnam War, but as it has to do with what was happening in this country at the time.
So, when I actually read that, is there a reason you chose a second generation Vietnamese American main character and a first generation Vietnamese American father rather than a first generation Vietnamese American main character and then an immigrant father?
Yeah, actually, I think it gets confusing, right? Because
Mhm.
for me, second generation is the first to be born in the U.S. To me is second. I know there's a lot of debate about this, about if that's first
Oh,
or second, because I would consider the ones who immigrate also Americans. They're the first generation because they came and then they became American. So right? So they're like the
Yeah.
first generation. But I don't know, I kind of get confused because sometimes when people say first gen, they mean second, and sometimes when they say second, they mean first. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
No.
so actually in the film, in both of my films, it is about the children who were born in the US to parents who came as refugees.
Oh, okay. All right, that definitely clears some things up because when I read that, yeah, I think growing up for me and Austin, we've always had that interpretation and that idea that first generation Asian American typically meant those that were born here, you know? But I guess I never entertained the thought that I people that did immigrate here did become American citizens, you know? So I guess in a way they do technically are seen as first generation Asian American. Well, honestly, that does open up a new perspective that is quite refreshing. And honestly, thank you for actually even clearing that up for us.
Yeah, no no worries. I think honestly it's a thing that comes up a lot,
Mm.
where people kind of are like, "Huh, I don't know which one I am." But yeah. But to answer the question that you asked, right? Like why talk about the generational divide? Mostly because that was my own experience. I I was born in the US. Both my parents were refugees of the Vietnam War. And they were quite young too when they came. They were adults, but they were young adults. And because of that, I always had questions about what happened to them and how different we are, and also like a language barrier. When I was young, I knew Vietnamese, but I didn't get to learn it in school or anything like that. So I only knew kind of limited, like, okay, I can talk to my parents about food and chores and school, maybe. But it was only as an adult that I kind of more bridged that gap. Both because they also know English. It's not like they don't know what I'm saying, but we always had such a gap in understanding that it's like literal language, but it was also experiences. And in why um, we just wanted to kind of in a small way, because it's a short film, right? It can't talk about everything. Explore how that also like there's also political differences that come from language, but also ways that we can connect. And I think that's what I am always trying to do with my films is like there is a divide, but it's not unbridgeable. And even with Hwai and her dad, even though they're very different and they, they don't get each other, there are moments where they can get each other.
I remember reading in some of your interviews that you talked about how for your parents, it was a different story of them coming to America than what most young Asian American youth hear. We usually hear our parents come here in order to create better opportunities for us. But you mentioned that your parents, they didn't leave their home to come to make a better opportunity for you. They came just purely because of the fallout of what was going on in the war, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting perspective that people like usually don't hear. I guess just because of the fact that there's that whole stereotype of when immigrants come here, it's to build better lives for their kids. So you want to tell us more, a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think people immigrate for many reasons. My parents were refugees, In many ways, they chose to, but then they also didn't, There's a lot that was happening in Vietnam at the end of the war, and a lot of people chose to leave for many different ways, in the same way that, a lot of people are choosing to leave now, even speaking about migrants at the US Mexico border who are coming from Central America, or the refugees who are coming through Europe from the Middle East. Like, of course, war is involved, but there's like, when we recognize that immigrants have multiple, desires and motivations for coming, I think it just makes us understand things more. Um, and the narrative about coming for a better life for your family, I think it's like a respectable one, and I think that's true for many people. Um, but then it also kind of, collapses the immigrants into like this small tiny box. Like my mom was like 18. She was maybe 17, 18 when she left Vietnam. So she was like on the verge of adulthood. And what 17, 18-year-old is like, "Oh, I'm going to come to America so that my children with my husband who I don't even know yet, like can have a better life." She's also, of course thinking about herself and her future and the kind of life she wanted to live. Um And I think my mother would never say it like that because I think there's a forced narrative upon her, like as a woman too, like to not be selfish. So I really want to honor those kinds of, agency that there are a lot of people who come for reasons and it's just as legitimate, even if they don't end up having kids, or like they didn't do it for kids, because parents are people too, and they're not just people's parents. They're like humans who have desires and motivations outside of their kids.
It must have been a pretty tough conversation to try to find out about their past with the Vietnam War and everything like that, because I kind of noticed that it is a very common thing between Vietnamese parents and people that came over during that time where they don't want to talk about it, you know? Like I remember reading a play slash musical written by a Vietnamese playwright, Quyen Nguyen, called Viet Gone, where the character is trying to interview his father asking about the Vietnam War, and then you find out he had to leave a previous family behind over there, and he just would rather not talk about it because he came to America to forget about it, and it's just not a happy time. So navigating that conversation with your parents, were there things that you learned about them that changed your perspective of who they were?
hmm I mean, I think so. Nook, which is actually available on two sites right now, for the visual communications, which runs the LA Asian Film Festival, have a copy of it up somewhere on their site and also on my Vimeo, so folks can check it out. Um, is exactly about what you just asked. So along the line somewhere between the language divide, interpersonal issues, right? And just the sheer trauma of my parents' experiences, I realized that you can't have that kind of conversation, right? In the way that it's so neat. You just sit down at a table and you're like, Mom, what happened to you? It's not gonna come out that way. Like even if they do share something, it's not gonna be satisfying, I think. It's not the whole story. Um, and so with Nook, I kind of leaned into that. I was like, how do I know about my mom? And it is through these little fragments of stories they tell throughout the years. Like it's a long game. It's not like one time you sit down, you ask your parents, and they tell you everything. You have to kind of like pay attention. You kind of collect like random stories they tell you. Like even if they're like yelling at you, they're like, "When I was a kid, I had to go to the river with a bucket.
Oh,
All you have to do is turn on the sink." But then you
Oh
store
boy.
that. You're like, "Okay, Dad had to go to a river with a bucket. Got it." And you store those stories and you kind of put them together, and that's how you understand your parents. It's
Yeah. Sometimes I don't even know what my parents' sense of humor is. I don't know if they're actually joking and exaggerating
yeah,
or anything like that. Because like I feel like with us, if we ever become parents, we'd all probably be like, "Oh, when I was your age, I survived a pandemic.
yeah, pretty much.
Millions of people died."
Oh,
So it's kind
yeah.
of like, yeah. So it's one of those things where we're just like, oh, there's probably truth to it, but then
Oh my
sometimes you wonder if they
gosh.
kind of do that bit of exaggeration just to like really guilt you into doing stuff. But that's a
Yeah,
whole other thing.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I find myself doing that now too. I'm like, when I was a kid, we had to plug in the to get the internet. We had to, stop the phone line. And then
oh,
people are like, "What?" And I'm like, "Yeah, like you can't use the phone and the internet at the same time because they use the same." And people are like, "I don't know how you lived,"
yeah.
you
Dial
know?
up was the worst.
Yeah.
But yeah, based on those descriptions and the conversation we've been having, I noticed there's a recurring theme that you have within your short films that to disprove. I noticed there's a recurring theme you have within your short films that's to disprove this idea, kind of a generational divide between Vietnamese communities. You've stated in an interview with LA Times that you find that those types of claims to be simplistic and that they imply a more liberal way of thinking within these communities as a result of assimilation into Western society. For the younger listeners out there that grew up believing that to be the truth, can you go more into detail about your thoughts on that false narrative of that generational divide?
I love talking about this because I think there's truth to it, right? That when you grow up in the States and your parents grow up somewhere, of course, you're going to be quote unquote Americanized. So you're going to understand the world differently. But sometimes I think it's like reductive. And people don't give their elders enough credit. Like just talking about my own parents. At this point in their life, they've been in the US way longer than they were even in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And and kind of with queer stories in particular, I find this coming up a lot, right? And Vietnamese parents will say this too, so it's not just the kids, but you'll either have a queer person go, my parents are Vietnamese, they're traditional, they don't accept my like queerness because, they're from Vietnam. And that's such a terrible story to say, right? Because that implies that Vietnam is automatically heterosexual and that there are no queer people in Vietnam. When actually, if your parents are like that, it's just because they're straight people. But there are also Vietnamese elders of our parents and our grandparents' generation. And so to kind of just by default saying stuff like that, that's what I have issue with, right? Or like parents who say, "Oh, you're just gay because you're Americanized." That is also a false narrative because I'm sure they have people their age and their parents' age who are gay, who are Vietnamese, who are not from the US. And when they say stuff like that, they're just trying to erase queer people in their own communities. So, but I understand because a lot of Viet folks, we kind of understand our own culture through our parents. That's our direct connection. Um, and so we kind of default to our parents as like the ones who know the truth about the culture, right? Instead of being like, oh, they're like a person within that community, but they don't know everything. And maybe like an example of that for me is like I think a lot of people think about their mother's cooking as traditional, and my mom's cooking is, but it's also hybrid. Like there's this dish called gandua. Um, it's like a sour soup, and I always thought the way my mom made gandua is like the Vietnamese way. And then I found out that my mom, she was in a refugee camp in Thailand and she loved Thai food. And she's like, actually, I like tom yum better. So I made a hybrid. So my gandua is actually kind of like more like tom yum. And I'm like, okay, I grew up my whole life like thinking, my mother is the bearer of traditional culture. And she's out here just mixing it up too.
Oh man. So this whole time you've been having a mixture of this Vietnamese and Thai dish, thinking like this is purely Vietnamese, and then she blew
Right,
your
right. And it's
mind.
not.
She blew your mind.
Yeah, and it's one of those things you probably don't realize until you ask them about it, or if you talk to other Vietnamese people and they're like, "What? That doesn't sound like the way
Mm,
my mom does it." And you're like,
this tastes like
"The heck?"
half of Vietnamese dish. Hmm.
Yeah. That's just my mom's spin on it. She's like, well, I just like Tom Yum more. So,
You know that sentiment you mentioned earlier about where some people believe that being queer is an American thing. It must have been very confusing for you when you were first discovering that part of yourself, right? Because you probably thought, oh, well, I mean, this isn't, or this is maybe a result or an influence of American culture. So, what was it like when you were first realizing that part of yourself that you were queer? Was it, did it feel a bit strange in conjunction with your Vietnamese culture?
yeah, and I will say it's more complicated than just like, oh, I'm Americanized. So my parents never, they never made me believe that they would, hate me or anything. We never talked about it, to be honest. Like I didn't, like they're like you can't date anyone until you're 30. So it's like didn't even matter. At the time, right? And so I think I knew for a while, but I didn't really come out until I was in college. And because I wasn't living with my parents, it wasn't that hard to sort of explore things. But I think what actually made me feel a divide is the politics. So like in terms of specifically like identifying as queer is kind of a leftist sort of genealogy in American political identity, right? Being queer, there's a lot of overlap with like socialism, communism, kind of Black Power movement. It's a little bit more left to be queer, and that's just the underlyingness of that formation. um, and then when you come from like a Southeast Asian refugee community who, became refugees because of wars during the Cold War that was over communism, right? The divide is there for me. It wasn't so much it's just the way that queerness in the US articulates certain language that, you know, I wouldn't say like all queer people identify as like communists or whatever. That would be a terrible conflation,
Whoa.
right? Even though McCarthy did that in the 1950s, they were like homosexuals are communists and therefore, but anyway, that's a whole nother
Yeah, that
history
train
thing,
of
right?
thought. I don't know
Yeah,
where that
like
came
I
from.
wouldn't say it like that, but because we kind of share some of the, you know, the language that is also shared by, you know, revolutions that caused for, not caused, but was a part of the wars that caused the displacement of our parents. There's a lot of things that trigger them, you know, even saying, some people like even saying things like people power, they're like, oh my god, that's what the communists say, right? And you know, and it's it that was what created the thing for me, I think. And I think that was a really hard thing to articulate, because I'm like, am I crazy? Like, am I the only one who is noticing this weird thing where, like, politically, it's there seems to be a divide. And I think a lot of that also, but leaning into that divide, I think there's also a lot of political diversity within Southeast Asian communities, Vietnamese community in particular. I don't know if we want to get into all this, but you know, there is a reputation that Vietnamese community is more conservative. And while that's somewhat true, that's also erasing the people who are not like that. And so when you think Vietnamese Americans conservative, queerness and gayness, American and like liberal or like progressive, then you kind of put them against each other when that's not always true. And that's kind of simplifying the Vietnamese American community.
And you basically want to take that message and just, I've noticed that you've taken that message and translated it into your short films, which is a conversation and a perspective a lot of people don't think about. For me, I will admit I never thought about those kind of things until I started reading your interviews, and it gave me that train of thought and perspective of, you know, I never really thought about that. You know, I thought, oh, you know, because my parents are have some conservative thoughts, I usually bought into that narrative of like, oh yeah, most like old like people usually give those kind of excuses to their parents of saying, oh, they're just traditional, you know, that's how they think. But then you don't ever really think like, oh, there's a spectrum for everything though, you know. While the one side is probably the one that's portrayed most of the time, there's always going to be people on the exact other side. And
Right. Yeah. And we
that's
just
yeah,
don't know them because they're not
Yeah.
our
yeah.
parents.
And they're probably overshadowed by like a majority, but then you never want to, you know, base an entire culture just on what you're being shown, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, following that sentiment, you've actually mentioned in other interviews about not just showing representation of stories from marginalized groups such as yours, but about starting to make stories for those groups versus for audience that don't belong to them, such as standard mainstream audiences. For some of the younger viewers that may not understand the significance behind that choice, can you explain why that is important to you?
Yeah. I, you know, when I was young, and I still am young, but when I was younger, I was fueled by anger, and I'm still angry now, and so I think anger is a legitimate emotion. But I was mostly fueled by anger, where I was like, I don't see stories like the ones like in the communities, not just Vietnamese American community, but I grew up in LA, and it's in that's where Hollywood is, and I'm like, what? How come I see stuff in Hollywood and it just doesn't even look like this high school I go to, you know? Like,
Why is everyone
and
super good looking and looks so much older?
That's
yeah,
true.
like yeah, the ones who play high schoolers
That
Like
are
are like
90210 or
well, they're
Degrassi.
oh, Teen Wolf
yeah.
especially. Oh man.
Oh my goodness. But you know, I wanted to break in and quote unquote change others' opinion of like our communities, right? Like I'm gonna be the representative of Vietnamese Americans, and I'm gonna like make people understand that we are not what they think we are. And I think that's important. But then in doing that, I neglect our own community, right? Like we all watch stuff too, and to make stuff that is for people who are like you is also important, because then you start to articulate to yourselves who you are. Like instead of always thinking about like what other people think you are, you focus on like who are we and what are our internal conversations. And you know, and I think that's a really important part of filmmaking. And what I'm trying to do with my films too.
I actually totally agree with that because I've noticed in certain films that have come out this year or certain TV shows like Squid Game or Shang-Chi, when they speak in their native tongue, obviously Hollywood's going to create the subtitles for it. And you kind of notice that they take out those little nuanced metaphors that our culture would understand if it were said properly. Like I think in Shang-Chi, one of the lines that Wen Wu said to one of the characters was, "Oh, be careful who you're talking to, boy. I've eaten more salt than you've eaten bowls of rice in your entire lifetime." But they just changed it to, "Oh, I've lived 10 of your lifetimes." It kind of took away that that nuance that would be meant for our audiences, and it kind of just felt like it was catered towards the American or majority like audience that wouldn't ever really understand the significance behind what that line would mean to us. So I do understand the idea of starting to create stories that are for us versus to show people who we are. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, because we are also like as communities constantly growing as well. So we got to feed our own conversations and develop ourselves as like people and as communities. And we don't want to be stagnant and have other people tell us who we
Yeah.
are, which is always happening. Um, but yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about the subtitles. Because in the one hand, you want to be not so complicated, so people get distracted if they don't know what they're talking about. But I think audiences are also much smarter
Then
than
Yeah.
Hollywood thinks.
yeah,
Sometimes it's like so simple, but it's like if you left it in there, it's fine. No one's gonna freak out.
right?
Like people will know if they don't know what it means, they might look it up. It's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of course. Um, After talking about all that, considering the contributions you've made in expressing queer and Vietnamese American stories through your short films, this is actually a personal question that I'm curious to know if you've ever had the worry of being placed in a box of creating purely queer or Asian American stories, or have you ever had any ideas or plans of creating other types of films that represent different things in the future?
Yeah, it's something I'm constantly thinking about. I mean, my first instinct is to say I don't feel limited because queer and Vietnamese American and even Asian American is so expansive. There's so many stories within even that quote unquote box, right? Or like that go under that category that I can be making films like all the time and in in those areas. Um, but then I also think that it is important, right? To sometimes like I think identity is important, but I think other things about ourselves are important, and we might kind of resonate with other stuff. So I do make documentaries. They are still about Asian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, but sometimes they don't censor queerness in the kind of prominent way. But I think that voice is always there because it's who I am. So even if I make a film that's not specifically about Vietnamese Americans, I think just because I'm working on them, that perspective is in there. Um, so I mean, I don't worry about being labeled as a queer Vietnamese American filmmaker. I do it to myself, and I think I'm really proud of it.
Yeah, I mean, on every screenwriter knows that the best things to write about the things you do know. So I understand about how you always will have that personal attachment, no matter what kind of story you're writing about. So, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. We once again thank our guest Win for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to talk about these things and to reflect also on my own filmmaking. And I really appreciate your questions, especially that last one is something I always think about.
To learn more about Win, check out their website, winnl.com. If you have any suggestions for future topics impacting our API youth, we'd love to hear from you. Also, be sure to subscribe as well as follow us on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as visiting our website, asianvoicesradio.com. Until next time, I'm Josden.
And I'm Osden.
And we'd like to thank you guys for listening today, and please join us again next time for another exciting and thought-provoking Asian Voices Youth Radio episode. Take care until then, everyone.